Hello, and welcome to the Word on the Street's April Book of the Month feature. In conversation this month are poet Lillian Necakov with Il Virus out from Anvil Press this month, and Stuart Ross, editor of the collection. A bit of background on our guests. Lillian Necakov is the author of 6 books of poetry, numerous chapbooks, broadsides, and leaflets. In 2016, her chapbook, The Lake Contains an Emergency Room, was shortlisted for the B.P. Nicol Chapbook Award. During the 1980s, she ran a micropress called the Surrealist Poets Gardening Association and sold her books on Toronto's Yonge Street. She ran the Bone Shaker reading series from 2010 to 2020. She lives in Toronto and just might be working on a new book. Welcome, Lillian.
Thank you.
And we also have Stuart Ross, a writer, editor, and writing teacher, the author of 20 books of fiction, poetry, and essays. His A Feed Dog book, imprint, is published by Anvil Press. Stuart received the 2019 Harbourfront Festival Prize for his contributions to Canadian literature and lives in Cobourg, Ontario. Welcome, Stuart.
Thanks so much, Maya.
Yeah, and I'll leave it to them to talk more about Il Virus.
Great. Hi there, Lillian. It's great to see you.
Hey, Stu. Great to see you.
So it was an amazing pleasure working on the massive book that Il Virus became. And it's funny to have this conversation now, months and months after we began working together. Things that I've been curious about, though. When you started off in this project and you posted your first poem on Facebook that became part of this collection, did you know this was going to be an ongoing thing? Were you planning to post regularly? And how long did you think this might go on for?
Good questions. The first thing I want to say is thank you. It was a pleasure working with you. It was just great, and I'm thrilled that we're at the end of it, and I'm excited that the book's going to be out soon. So, So to answer your questions, so when I first started working on this, I had like zero expectations, no intent other than to, sit down on a Sunday morning. When it was really quiet and everyone was asleep, drink my coffee and just write a poem. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to post this. And that was on March 15th, 2020. So it was just 2 days after they announced that we were going to have a 2-week stay-at-home, or there was a stay-at-home order for 2 weeks. And so I thought, okay, whatever. And then I kind of had the inkling that, maybe, what am I going to do for 2 weeks? Maybe I could knock off a few poems here and there, post them on Facebook. 2 weeks would end, we'd go back to work, and that would be it. And then, really, I didn't imagine, what we were facing and how long this would go on for. And so I had absolutely, kind of, as I said, no idea how long this was, like all of us, how long this was going to last, where we were going to go, where we were going to be. And so I just continued writing. I didn't really know when it was going to end. I kind of had this idea in my mind that, okay, the project would end when I went back to work. But I had no idea when that was going to be. So, sorry, you going to say something?
No, go ahead, please.
So then what was happening is, as I was writing, was that I started to kind of, reevaluate my work, and the pandemic was forcing me to kind of really stretch my imagination, and it compelled me to, step outside of myself and to reflect. I want to say, I don't really like that word reflect, but to engage with what was going on around me, and then to write about it. Yeah.
At the risk of doing that, where do you get your inspiration kind of a question? But I have to ask, each day as you sat down to write, how did you settle on what you're going to write each day? Did you have something in your mind, or did the blank screen or the blank piece of paper just suggest what was going to come up?
Sure, I'll get to that, but I just want to finish with the first question, if that's okay, because I have a couple other things I wanted to say about it.
Okay.
So I really wanted the writing to be accessible. I didn't want to do that, whole navel gazing thing, although there's probably some of that in there too. But as I said, I really wanted the work to be accessible, and I hope it is. I wanted to speak to the moment and to be kind of like an archive or evidence of, what we were all going through. And especially because I was, sharing it as daily dispatches over Facebook. You know, so that was kind of, once I realized that, hey, I'm in this, I'm going to do it. That was kind of my intent. And yeah, so once I started doing that, I thought, okay, I can't turn back. So I just kept going. I kept going. And but I had, I did have that idea that when I go back to work, this is when it ends. And that's really what did happen. So in a way, I'm grateful that, my time at home lasted for a bit longer so I could actually come up, create this book, because I'm really happy with it. In terms of, how I settled on what to write, that's a toughie, because really it was more settling on what not to write, because there was so much chaos and information and misinformation and anger and fear and frustration and grief and all these things coming at us all the time. And it was just like, like, what do you write about? And it was just kind of like, whatever, when I sat down, whatever, I just kind of plucked these things out of the air. I riffed off people's work that they were posting, their art, their music, the articles I was reading. I wrote about the things that I saw on my walks with my dog. And really, in doing all of that, it was kind of like, I had the sense that I was, it was a way out of my physical confinement to write this stuff. And yeah, there was just so much to write about. So I'd go to bed with like all these crazy ideas in my head, first lines, last lines of poems, images. It was constant. And the only time that I could really kind of focus and kind of lose myself and be still and relax was in the process of the writing. So that was really a great thing. Yeah.
Well, the book has such incredible range, and now you're talking about it as sort of poet as witness, and also a way of funneling these incredibly alien experiences that you were going through. How did it feel when you started talking about gathering all these together in book form, and then you came up with the title Il Virus? How did it feel to gather all those poems into one file as you were assembling it all for publication? And what do you think might be the effect? What did you think about what might be the effect all these pieces gathered together under one cover would have, rather than trickling out gradually on social media? What was that feeling?
So to gather it together, I was thrilled. It was thrilling to see it as a body of work, and I was really proud of the writing, because I hadn't really sat down and looked at it. I just posted, as I said, day by day, and I didn't really sit down to read through it until it was done and it was ready to, be edited. So while I was writing the pieces, as I said, it was a way of steadying myself and, moving through this grief and getting lost in the process. It made me sane, really. But once it was completed, I felt sort of like, the sheep were gathered, and everything was in place. And they were fenced in by those damn birds whispering about the humans, at the beginning and the end of the book. So I didn't really realize the impact of the work that it might have on me, even when it was gathered in one place. There were pieces that I would go back to and think, holy crap, oh, wow, I wrote that. Wow. And in a good way. And also, it brought me back to those specific days and those feelings, and all those things that I was experiencing, even some of the smells and the tastes. It was very visceral going back to it. And I hope that, that sense, that'll be conveyed to the reader. I really hope that.
Yeah, it's that is interesting because of course you were writing those poems one or sometimes perhaps more than one a day for almost 100 days or around 100 days. And so by the time you got to the end, you would never really remembered those earlier poems until you revisit
Exactly.
them. And then you're really reliving those moments. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So there's an incredible range of subject matter and personal things and family things and popular culture that you draw on throughout the book. But as the book progresses, I noticed, especially as we move towards the last third of it, the last third of the poems, the forms become more expansive and more varied. There's prose poems, there's list poems. They're all the poems take on different forms using the page as a different kind of field. How did that come about? Was it like the boredom or the nature of what you were feeling after months of lockdown, or what was that? How did that occur?
Well, I wouldn't say that there was never boredom. I was never bored. Far from it.
Hmm.
I kind of hoped for periods of boredom and quiet and just, but that didn't happen. I think it's a couple of things. So content, I guess, really began to dictate, the form. I was thinking, about these, big sort of questions and about being and existence and our place and were we going to be alive tomorrow, like all these crazy big giant thoughts. And you know I thought, okay, well, that's what I was thinking of, that's what I was moving towards, these bigger things. And that sort of, as I said, that dictated the form of the poetry, of the poems. I was thinking outside of my own sphere about the crazy shit that was happening in the world, in the White House, marginalization of whole groups of people, the Black Lives Matters protests, the killing of innocent BIPOC peoples. There was so much there, and some of the pieces later, um, I guess, reflected my anger at what was going on,
Hmm.
and they became almost like rants. So I'm thinking specifically about piece number 85 that begins with Allen Ginsberg climbs up the drain pipe. That's sort of like a rant, sort of like, I don't know, my need to kind of rail against this complacency that, you know, and I think that's kind of why the form changed. And also, I think the book to me is like a piece of music, right? So it starts off very quietly and it builds and builds and builds, and then there's a crescendo and it expands, and then it comes back and it's quiet again at the end. So I
Mhm.
see it, there's a real movement I see in it. Um, and that really wasn't the intention when I first sort of sat down to work on it. Maybe it was on some unconscious level. I'm not really sure. Um, but I guess I just sometimes we just have to holler, and that's kind of what went through the piece, and it moved it along, and it grew and expanded. Um, but when I got to the end, the way the collection begins and ends was definitely intentional. I began and ended with those birds whispering about the humans. Um, and for me, that idea about the birds talking about us is very much about human accountability to the environment, and also, our accountability to one another. So that was very intentional. That kind of, you know,
Yeah, you often take on these sort of massive, or you have at least a couple of times taken on these massive projects like this one. And you mentioned the birds now that begin and end that frame this book or bookend it. Um,
mhm.
and a few years ago, you did another project, 1,000 birds, was it? You wrote 1,000 poems about birds.
Yes.
So taking on these sort of monumental tasks upon yourself as a poet, what's that about?
Well, I like deadlines. I like
Okay.
having sort of like, a vision of this is going to happen during this period of time. I like to be challenged. And otherwise, I'm just lazy and I'm not gonna, I'll write something here and there. But if I know that, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna do this from this date to this date, and I'm just gonna work. I love that. And that gets me that inspires me. That gets me going. So that really works for me. I love a challenge.
That's amazing to hear, because I think that there's a sort of an anarchic nature to your poetry in some way, that sort of that you are willing to go in so many different directions and pivot so quickly. So it's interesting that you like to do that within, deadlines, within some controlled kind of structure. I wanted to ask the experience of doing that, and I know you've done a lot of writing since you finished Il Virus. Has the pandemic actually affected the nature of your writing, do you think, in any sort of profound or permanent or temporary way?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely, it has. I think that this is my most, Iliadus is my most expansive and emotional book, really. And that's just obviously a direct result of the events of this past year. I mean, obviously, how could it not be? But, I think my writing has become more filled with kind of information. And maybe that's because I have time to really delve into the things that I'm interested in, whereas before I might not have had the time to really get into these subjects that I want to sort of explore and delve into. I don't know, or maybe it's just, a function of the time that we're in, because there is so much information out there. But it's definitely I find that my writing is a lot more responsive to what's going on out there, and other people's art and other people's struggles in the community. And it's not so much about me. I mean, it's always about you as the poet, but it's more about how you are reacting or engaging with, or, what you're feeling about what's out there, not what's in here so much. So I think that, and I don't know if that's a permanent thing. I hope it is, because I think I've grown as a writer and I'm more interested in the stuff that I'm writing. I think it's, as I said, more expansive. And yeah, I'm excited. We have 5 minutes, I see.
There was the feeling that two things. One was that this was a process of processing what you were going through, finding ways to, deal with the anger, the grief, the loss, all those various things. But also, it did feel like that it was a conversation, that you were having a conversation with musicians, with other writers, with artists, with scientists.
Mhm.
And that's one of the beautiful things about the book, is you're reaching out, conversing, and exchanging with all of these things that I guess you were intaking through that period.
Yeah. And I think that is sort of, it was building community, because, we were so isolated, all of us. I felt that, and we still are. But, at that was like, oh my God, we've never experienced anything like this before. So it was building community, sending those poems out into the world, getting feedback, listening to other people's work, and I think that's really one of our, roles as poets, is to do that, to build community, and to make space for diverse and marginalized voices, especially the young, because there's so many young writers out there, to create safe spaces for them, and to bring them into the community, and to be part of their community. So I think that was a really important thing for me during this project.
Well, on the topic of the role of the poet, you just talked one aspect of it. Do you think, if this doesn't sound too grandiose, the role of the poet during a catastrophic event like this, and the kind of event, in North America, in recent history that we haven't really had, what do you think the role of the poet is on a local level, on a global level, or is that something you can speak to?
Well, I don't think that there's a much difference now during our time between the global and the local, because we live in such a globalized world, right? So, I mean, your neighbors are the, not the people that live next door to you. I mean, really, we've got global neighbors. 30, 40 years ago, before the internet and social media, that would have been something, there would have been a difference, but there really isn't so much of it, of a difference. So I think, as a poet, what is your role? It's to write. You have to write about everything, but you have to write authentically, right? You've got to write your own story, your truth. You got to, and as I said, it's also really important for us to build community. And the Mexican-American poet, Juan Felipe Herrera, who I love, he talks about what he calls a new segregation and a manufactured way of talking about others. And he says that poetry can speak across this segregation. So that, I think, is such a huge thing that we, as poets, I mean, I'm not, as I said, I'm not trying to be grandiose or anything, but I mean, even just in, we can do that. We can speak across segregation with even like a tiny poem, and we can build community. And I think that is something that is, we have to do. I don't know. Maybe I'm just full of crap. I don't know. All I know is that our role is not to suffer in silence. That's for sure.
Right on. That's a good place to wrap up. And it's really been a pleasure after working with you on the book for so many months. It's great to finally have had this conversation. And thank you so much. And I wish you well with the book. And to those of you tuning into the podcast, Il Virus is part of the A Feed Dog book imprint from Anvil Press, a Vancouver-based literary publisher, and you can look for it or order it at your favorite local bookstore. Thanks a lot, Lillian.
Thank you so much, Stuart.